What's really good, everybody? This is Nathan Allebach, and welcome to the podcast where we get into people's stories and go down a bunch of rabbit holes about what's really good in the world. For today's episode, I spoke with Massimo Pigliucci. Massimo is a philosophy professor at the City College of New York, a biologist, author, social critic, and the former co-host of the Rationally Speaking podcast, which is one of my favorites out there. He also currently hosts a podcast called Stoic Meditations, where he releases episodes that are about 2 minutes long of mantras and wisdom pieces from the great Stoic thinkers of Greece and Rome. And he also just released a new book titled How to Be a Stoic, Using Ancient Philosophy to Live a Modern Life, which we got into a bunch throughout the episode. We also touched on the moral dilemmas of free will and justice, virtue signaling, sensationalism, reactionary movements, navigating the pop culture of public intellectuals, and how to internally work on the self before projecting out into the world. You can donate to Massimo's Patreon if you just Google his name and Patreon. It'll come up right away. He offers exclusive essays and other content to help fund his work, which is really incredible if any of the topics I mentioned here interest you. This conversation we had was a real honor for me, so I hope you all enjoy it. Now let's get into what's really good. And we're live. Massimo, thank you for coming on the podcast.
It's a pleasure.
Hey, so just to give some background, some information to go off of for those who may not know who you are, what you do, I like to get these talks started with just some background context, some storytelling. So if you don't mind, you can keep it short or go as long as you want, but can you get a little bit into your story, just growing up and how you got into the work you do now?
Oh, we're going to go that far. Sure. Very briefly. So I grew up in Rome. Initially, I studied a career as a biologist in evolutionary biology, and I was doing that for 20 plus years. And then at some point, midlife crisis hit, basically, and I started looking for something else to do. And I happened to think that philosophy was a good second career. So I went back to school, got my PhD in philosophy, and changed profession. Awesome. Now, so at the same time, of course, it wasn't just a professional thing. It was also a question of what I am in life and, what's going on and what am I going to do with the second half of my life, that sort of stuff. So I started looking also for some kind of more coherent philosophical framework. I grew up Catholic, but I left the church when I was in my teenage years. And then after that, I consider myself a secular humanist. That went on for just fine for several decades. But then I was always a little unhappy with that label, because secular humanism to me is not really a philosophy. It's just like a list of things that I agree with.
Yeah, right.
In terms of, sort of politically and so on and so forth. But it's not really a coherent sort of framework for one's life. And I figure out, once I started studying philosophy, I figured out that the right answer had to be somewhere in the ballpark of virtue ethics. That really resonated with me. So I started the obvious place, which is Aristotle. And Aristotle is great. It's a lot of interesting stuff there, but it didn't really click. So the next stop was Epicurus, which is actually apparently pretty popular among secular humanists. That's largely because of his metaphysics. He thought that the world is, random atoms in the void, that kind of thing. So I looked at Epicurus as well, but there was a big problem with Epicurus, which is he actually suggested that in order to avoid pain, especially mental and emotional pain, we should stay away from political and social engagement. That was not an option for me. So I was doing that sort of stuff, that kind of search. And then one day on my Twitter account, I see this thing that says, "Help us celebrate Stoic Week." And I said, what the hell is Stoic Week? And why would anybody want to celebrate it? I was kind of familiar with the Stoics from high school because I studied philosophy and Latin. So I actually translated Seneca. It never occurred to me that somebody could actually adopt in the 21st century Stoicism as a philosophy of life. But I was curious, and I was in that kind of place, so I signed up, and I did practice these basic exercises and do some basic readings in Stoicism for a week. And at the end of the week, I said, this is interesting. I think I'm going to continue for another couple of months. And then at the end of a couple of months, I said, this is interesting. I think I'm going to continue for another year. And here we are, several years later, I'm still doing it.
That's so awesome. So, yeah, Stoicism, just to give people an idea, like how big is that ideology or movement, whatever you want to call it, around the world? 'Cause it's not really something that gets talked about in sort of the pop culture fields,
No, that's right. Although increasingly so, it's getting more and more popular. Even when I started a few years ago, there were only a few books about modern Stoicism, and a few places online you could go to look up stuff. Now there is a very vibrant Facebook community with more than 40,000 people signed up for it. There's an increasing number of books, and even sort of mainstream media begins to cover philosophy. But yeah, basically, it's a philosophy of life. Now, philosophy of life is essentially a framework or a compass, if you will, that allows you to orient yourself and make decisions. Cut the crap, basically. Decide what's important to you and what it's not, and how to go about your regular life existence. We all come with we all have a philosophy of life, whether we realize it or not. If you grow up within a religious tradition, for instance, every religion is also a philosophy of life. Because the two components of a philosophy of life are in metaphysics and in ethics. So the metaphysics tells you some kind of story about how the world works, and the ethics tells you how you're supposed to behave in the world. So if you're a Christian, for instance, of course, your metaphysics includes a God that is an all-powerful and all-omniscient and so on and so forth, who created the universe and scope of life. The meaning of life is basically to deserve some kind of praise from this God. And the ethics, of course, the Christian ethics is about being nice to your neighbors and offer the other cheek and all that sort of stuff. If you're a Buddhist, similarly, you have both a metaphysics and an ethics, and so on and so forth. So Stoicism is just one other version of this. And the basic idea of Stoic philosophy is that a good life, a life worth living, is a life of virtue, and in particular, a life that practices four cardinal virtues, and these are practical wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance. Practical wisdom is the virtue that tells you the difference between right and wrong, basically, the difference between what is good for you and what is not good for you. Courage is not just physical, but especially moral courage, the courage to stand up to do the right thing. Justice is concerned with how do you deal with other people, what is the right way of dealing with other people, how to be fair to others. And then temperance is the idea that you need to do things in right proportion, right measure, neither too much nor too little. And what Stoicism says is that if you follow the four virtues and you keep in mind that certain things are up to you, but other things are not up to you, that's referred to as the dichotomy of control. And then you should be focusing on the things that are up to you, things you can actually control, and then just basically let the rest go as it goes on itself. Then you will be living a life that when you get to the end of it, you look back and you say, yep, that was good. That was a good thing.
Right, yeah, that's super fascinating. I tracked with you through all that when it comes to just the sort of ideological differences between someone that was born, say, in the West 50 years ago when Christianity was really super common. I mean, it's still obviously at least somewhere around 50% in America of the population identifies with some form of Christianity. But as we've seen, secularism more on the rise in the past couple decades, you see this sort of divide between how people choose not just their ideology, but like what moral compass they want to live their life by. Whereas, someone like myself, I was raised in an evangelical family, and if they were to hear a lot of what you were putting out right there, I think their gut reaction would be, okay, like that's all great. Pragmatically, all that sounds really good, but what, like you were saying before, what are the meta beliefs underneath all this? And similarly, on contrast to that, then from the more secular people in my life, where when they look at how to live with their moral compass. To your point, what you were saying before, there's not many secular humanist ideological frameworks that really give you an identity as a person. So this is like giving you a philosophical identity to live by. So sort of like, so now that we're in this like postmodern era where, you know, there's always competing, not just between Christianity and secularism. I mean, we have the whole religious spectrum, and then we have all these now more secular leaning ideologies. Like, how and why do you choose Stoicism, and how does it stand out above a lot of these other ways of living that have been coming out in the past few decades?
I think that, so first of all, let me premise that I don't think that Stoicism is necessary for everybody. I mean, it's one way to go, but there are others. So I don't necessarily think it's superior to other philosophies of life. It works well for me, and it works well for a good number of people. But, you know, and also you were mentioning the difference between sort of East and West. Stoicism, in my mind, is really pretty much the Western equivalent of Buddhism, because even though their metaphysics are very different, their ethics are very, very similar. Stoicism teaches some notions very similar to the Buddhist notion of non-attachment, to the Buddhist idea that you have to choose, you know, a right way, right speech, right action, and so on and so forth. But let me answer your question a little more specifically. That is, one of the reasons I find Stoicism interesting is because it has these two good components in my mind. One is it's very practical. The Stoics, in fact, were so practical in terms of their they actually did exercises, what we would today call spiritual exercises, but or practices. But they were so pragmatic that a lot of these practices at the beginning, sort of middle part of the 20th century, started to inform modern forms of cognitive behavioral therapy. So, you know, cognitive behavioral therapy, rational and emotive behavioral therapy, and a bunch of others were actually inspired directly by the writings of Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, and Seneca. And so that right there tells you that, you know, pragmatically speaking, it actually works. Because these kind of therapies actually are so-called evidence-based therapies. But I think it's also interesting from a philosophical perspective, because Stoicism is very clearly a naturalistic philosophy, a naturalistic kind of ethics. So it rejects supernaturalism. The Stoics, the ancient Stoics didn't mention God, but it turns out that what they meant by God was the universe itself. And so it's what sometimes today is called Einstein's God. You know, Einstein famously, you know, was asked if he believed in God, and he said, "Well, I believe in the laws of nature." Now, the Stoics, the ancient Stoics, were what I would say what we would today call pantheists, because they thought that the universe is in fact the same thing as God, but they also conceived of the universe as a living organism that was doing its own thing, and basically we were the little bits and pieces of that gigantic organism. Now, of course, today we don't think of the universe that way. We accept, or at least I accept, whatever physics tells us about how the universe works. But it's the same idea. Modern Stoics think that ethics is naturalistic, meaning that ethics is about figuring out how to live well with other people, essentially. It's a question of applying reason to social living. And that's what the Stoics kept saying over and over. In fact, they had a slogan, basically. They said that we should live according to nature. And living according to nature, living according to nature doesn't mean running naked into the forest and hug trees. What it means is to take seriously human nature. And they thought that human nature is fundamentally made of two components. The two fundamental things and most important things about human nature are two. One, that we're social animals, and therefore we thrive only in society. Yes, we can survive on our own if we have to, but we thrive only in society. And two, that we're capable of reason. We're the only animal on Earth that is capable of articulating its reasons for doing things or not doing things. And they thought that from that you can derive the general idea that therefore to live ethically means to apply reason to improve social living. They were among the very first cosmopolitan philosophers, for instance. They thought that it's an accident of birth if you are, you know, American or Italian or whatever it is, and fine, you have some kind of duty toward your local community for sure, as a result of sort of an accident of birth. But your fundamental duty is toward humanity at large. You know, you should treat everybody in the same way. In fact, they were among the very first who started questioning slavery, for instance, and they explicitly advocated gender equality. They thought that women are just as capable as men of learning philosophy because they're capable of reason, and so there's no reason to discriminate against either women or any other group.
Wow, that's so crazy. Yeah, so I guess they would have been perhaps proponents of the non-existence of free will to a certain degree then, right? If they're believing, a lot of what humans are born on, a lot of it's accidental birth, a lot of it's circumstances that are out of our control. And just like a lot of what you said there with how they talked about what human nature is at its core, like the way to live naturally. I think there's sort of that skewed perception in our modern day lens where you have like the sort of far perspective of something that's all natural, and it gives off this vibe that, oh, it's just all good, like everything's all good vibes, whereas nature it's the good and the bad, it's something very vicious,
yes,
but
exactly.
It's something very, like you had said, like it's intrinsic. There's this thing that we have inside of us that allows us not just to have reason, but it allows us to commit terrible acts, and it's like this thing that we have to constantly be dealing in the tension with, and it's not just like a one-way trip.
That's right. I mean, for instance, xenophobia is a perfectly natural human trait.
Exactly.
It probably evolved back in the Pleistocene because it was adaptive to be wary of people who look differently from you because they were probably aggressors, right? But today, the Stoics would say, we have reason, we know better, we can actually talk to people, and we can actually live together, or at least try to live in harmony. It's an interesting thing you mentioned, free will. The Stoics were determinists for sure. They had an interesting theory of cause and effect. They thought that the universe is essentially works by cause and effect, and these universal web of cause and effect, of course, does not exclude humans. Humans are part of it. Mm. But the way they presented this, they thought about human volition, right? The human ability of making decisions was interesting. One of the major ancient Stoics was a guy named Chrysippus, who was an incredible logician. He made contributions to logic that were much more important, actually, I shouldn't say more important, but certainly more advanced than those of Aristotle. And Chrysippus came up with this interesting analogy. He said, so imagine a cylinder, right? The geometrical figure. Mm-hmm. That if you put it on your table, and then you push it, what is the cylinder going to do? It's going to roll, right? And if I ask you, well, why is the cylinder rolling? The intuitive answer is, well, because I just pushed it, right?
Right.
But then Chrysippus said, but hold on. That is part of the reason. That certainly is one of the causes that is making the cylinder roll. But the other cause is internal. It's the fact that it's a cylinder. If it were a cube, It wouldn't roll, right? Or if it were, a pyramid, it wouldn't roll. It would either not move at all, or it would just topple over, but it certainly wouldn't roll. This was his way to explain how human volition works. Human volition, that is human decision-making, is a combination of external causes and internal ones. Right? The external causes are things that happen to you, things to which you react, other people's opinions, you name it.
Right.
The internal causes, we would say today, include, of course, your genes, but they also include the fact that your brain is, in fact, a very sophisticated decision-making machine. And so you have what the Stoics call a character, right? You have your own character. Your character is essentially your complicated set of algorithms for how to make decisions. Mm. And what they thought was that character can be improved because character is flexible, it's plastic, and it can be improved over time. And that was a major goal of Stoic training throughout your life.
Okay.
You start out with whatever it is that nature gave you, and then little by little, by the influence of others and by your internal decision-making processes, you actually get better. You improve. And there's nothing, there's nothing magical about it. It's all deterministic. It's all cause and effect. But it's a very nice account of how it is that we have volition.
Yeah, it's so nice to be able to take something like that to use to step outside of yourself day to day. When you look at, especially nowadays, we have these just really tight tribal identities that we're competing between, and it seems like every time someone makes whether the mistake is minor or it's a tragedy, the knee-jerk reaction, because it is part of our nature, is to react. That is the other, that is the enemy, that is, the target of whatever the wrongdoing or the slip-up was. But it's really helpful to have a framework like that to be able to constantly, like we were saying before, like deal with that tension, because when you're working day to day, like I constantly have to catch myself in so many different social instances where I'm in a situation and I see how somebody else is reacting to something, and my gut reaction to their reaction is, that's wrong. I don't understand why they would be doing that. And I have to constantly be gut checking myself to remember, I don't understand, like I don't know what it is to be in that person's brain. Like I don't know what it is to be in that person's, not just their biology, but the experiences of their upbringing, their surroundings. And these are all things that are really difficult to grapple with when we live in these binary systems of right and wrong, because we want to believe that we are all good people. We want to believe that our character is fully developed on our own free will, whereas a lot of what you're saying here is that it's malleable by not just our own choices, but just by what life throws at us that's out of our control.
Correct. And a major thing that I like about Stoicism is precisely that it's non-judgmental. It's a very self-forgiving as well as other-forgiving philosophy. One of the Stoics actually had an exercise to deal with the situation you're talking about, and they said, so Epictetus, for instance, tells his students to try to redescribe situations in a more objective fashion without judgments, without adding the judgment. So he said, you see somebody and you say, oh, he's drinking too much. And he says, don't say he drinks too much. Say, he's drinking a certain quantity. because after all, you don't know, as you just said, you don't know where he's coming from. You don't know. First of all, you don't know if he can take it or not. I mean, maybe that's too much for you, but not for him. And second of all, even if it isn't, you don't know where he's coming from. You're not in his shoes. You don't know anything about him or very little about him. And therefore, it doesn't really help to start immediately getting judgmental toward people. It raises a barrier between you and the other person that it's actually unnecessary, and artificial.
Yeah, so this brings up the whole topic of sort of consequentialism then, because a lot of people who look to that way of thinking that you're talking about, that we're kind of going back and forth on here, and they say then, okay, well, how can you judge right or wrong? It becomes this whole, again, this sort of postmodern mess that we're in, where when we get down to these meta points and we're talking about, the reasons underneath the reasons and why we ought to act a certain way and why we need to step outside of ourselves in these instances, people always point to the big obvious ones. They point to war, they point to murder, they point to rape, they point to the things that almost universally that we look at as wrong. So when it comes to actually defining right and wrong and how we judge that on an individual to individual basis, how do you sort of comprise that with the ideology of Stoicism?
So the Stoics were very clear that, as I mentioned earlier, one of the four virtues is justice. So they were very clear that there are things, that are actions that people engage in that are unjust, they're unfair, and need to be stopped. Right. What they do is they don't add on top of that the value judgment, and you, by the way, are an evil person. And the reason they do that is because they say, look, everybody, even really people that would normally be described as really bad, everybody thinks that they're doing the right thing.
Yes.
Everybody has reasons for what they're doing. Even seriously misguided people have good reasons. I mean, nobody wakes up in the morning, goes in front of the mirror and says, "Wah ha ha, what kind of evil can I do with that?" I mean, nobody does that.
Yeah.
I mean, if you want to take the obvious example, not even Hitler probably did that.
Yeah, right.
In his mind, he was doing right by the German people. He really was convinced that the German race was, the Aryan race was superior, and so on and so forth. Nobody wants to do bad things on purpose. Of course, they do bad things, period.
Yeah.
And so we need to stop them. This is not a license, not to intervene. Stoicism was definitely not a quietist philosophy. I mean, all the major Stoics were actually politicians or generals. So these were people that were very much up to action, and in order to stop either with by legislation or, if necessary, by war, other people from doing the wrong thing. But they just said, look, on top of, once you do that, once you stop the person, what's the point of making yourself feeling better by saying, oh, he's evil?
Right.
By saying that somebody else is evil, you're essentially dehumanizing him. And dehumanizing somebody is never a good idea, because you risk not understanding where the other person is coming from. And understanding is not the same thing as condoning. It's not the same thing as saying, oh, well, that was okay. It's not okay. Let me give you an example. So an example that touches Americans very, very closely. You remember, of course, 9/11, right? And one of my Italian, one of my compatriots in Italy, a very, very good and very famous writer, Umberto Eco, wrote a editorial shortly after 9/11, which was, I imagine, provocatively entitled "Understanding Bin Laden." And by understanding Bin Laden, he didn't say condoning Bin Laden. He didn't say, oh, yeah, the guy, whatever, you do this, he does that, same thing, it doesn't matter. But he was saying, if you don't understand, if you're dehumanizing, if you say, oh, he's evil incarnate or something like that,
right,
then you don't understand why what happened.
Yeah,
you don't understand that there are causes, there are reasons. They may be misperceived and misguided reasons, but there are reasons. And if you don't pay attention to them, this is bound to happen again.
Yeah, that's, I think, one of the core issues, at least in today's climate. I mean, it's always been an issue. I guess now it's being highlighted because of social media and how closely we pay attention to each and every tragedy and issue like this, where there is that false equivalence between someone saying, I want to understand the other versus, I hate the other. And there's this thing that people think that if I say, what this person did was wrong, but I want to understand them, that I am somehow condoning that. And it's this really weird linguist game that we're trapped in, where everything is, we're kind of defining the terms differently in these cases. And I think, like you had mentioned, like 9/11, that's a super hot button topic. Another one I was thinking while you're saying all that was pedophilia. And that's a huge one, where you have people who, it's one of the hottest, just fiery topics. Anytime someone is found out to be a pedophile, then all you have to do is look at online comments and the things people say. And like a lot of it, again, coming from this aspect of justice that you're talking about from Stoicism, a lot of it is it's like rightful rage. A lot of it is rage in defense of something good, which is the innocence of a child in this case. And it's in defense of that, and it's attacking the evil of this offensiveness of a pedophile. But it gets construed and mixed in with all this hateful, intentional lack of understanding, where we want to just paint that person as evil no matter what. We don't want to have to go in to the neurology of who they are and why they did this, which really begs this interesting question, when we're talking about whether it is something like pedophilia, or it's something like terrorism, or something like the rapist, or there's all these different moral, obvious moral atrocities, these areas of moral atrocity that we can define now, but it begs this question of what it's going to look like in the future when, say, like we acquire this pedophile and we have him in custody and we know what he's done, and we actually have the tools to go into their brain and to remove the part of them that would be, enacting on that. And it's like, what do you do with that person then? Because now you've gone in and you've addressed where that was coming from. It doesn't take away what they did. What they did still happened, and that there has to be justice for that. But it unravels all these moral questions that we have to start wrestling with.
In fact, I can give you a real-life example of this. This has already happened. So there was an interesting case a number of years ago, which I actually present in one of my books, in Answers for Aristotle. And so this guy was in the United States, somewhere in the sort of southeast part of the country. Perfectly normal person, never had a problem before, never had any bizarre thoughts in his life. But then all of a sudden starts downloading child pornography.
Oh, wow.
He gets caught. Yeah, he gets caught. And, he goes on trial and all that sort of stuff. And then they find out that he has a brain tumor. And the brain tumor is affecting the area of the brain that actually are in charge of sort of essentially moral decision making, as we would say.
Yeah.
So what do? They take out the tumor, and the behavior disappears. The craving for the child pornography completely disappears. So what are you doing? What are you going to do at that point? Are you still going to convict him? I would argue no, because the guy was literally sick. He had a tumor. He was not in charge of his own actions,
right?
Of his own urges, right? So now for the Stoics, we are all sick in a sense. In fact, they had a word for this. Of course, some of us more than others, but they had an interesting word for that, which I would love to reintroduce sort of in the modern vocabulary. The word is amatia, which is spelled Thia. And amatia is ancient Greek for, it's often translated as ignorance, but it's not really ignorance. It means lack of wisdom. In other words, often we just don't know what we're doing. We don't know what the good thing, the really good thing to do is, and we do whatever it is that comes to our mind. We rationalize, we make all sorts of bad decisions because we are fundamentally unwise.
Right.
Some of us pathologically so, and hence you get these people that eventually get in trouble with the law or they do something really awful. But to some extent, it's a matter of degree, according to the Stoics. We're all unwise. We all suffer from amatia. And I suspect that the behavior you're talking about earlier, right, of hatred towards somebody who commits a crime, I can't help but thinking that to some extent that's because we don't want to be associated with that kind of person, because at some level we know that we might actually under different circumstances be in their position.
Right.
And we just don't want to think that way.
Yeah.
There's a modern philosopher, Thomas Nagel, who wrote a brilliant paper a number of years ago called Moral Luck, where he argued that, most of us think of ourselves as good people. But in fact, most of the time, we're just lucky people. That if we were born under Nazi Germany, we would probably aid and abet the Nazi regime.
Yep.
And, there was nothing, that millions and millions of Germans were not evil. We're just human beings that were reacting to their environment in a certain way rather than another. And to mount on your high horse and say, no, I would never do something like that. It's just complete, believe me, those are, subhuman. I don't think so. I'm pretty sure that, under those circumstances, many of us, there are exceptions, of course. There were exceptions also in Germany. There were brave people who stood up to Hitler, and some of them lost their lives as a result. But those are the exceptions. The overwhelming majority of humanity is fundamentally flawed and fundamentally unwise. So I think it's a good idea to just take it easy on other people and say, look, this was a bad thing. It needs to be stopped. The other thing, by the way, that the other connection here is that the Stoics would definitely oppose retributive justice. Right? They would say that, sure, if you need to stop somebody and if that person needs to be, put away in jail or something like that, so that he cannot no longer hurt other people. Absolutely, you should do it. But the idea of putting somebody in jail or sentencing him to death as a rewenge, as a punishment for what is done, that's completely alien to Stoic philosophy. And what are you doing? Now you are lowering yourself to the level of a beast. Or in fact, Seneca says you're even lower than a beast, because most beasts don't, most animals don't actually seek revenge.
Right.
They just defend them. They defend themselves, but they don't go after other people for revenge.
Yeah, it seems that in a lot of these cases, it really is so often that we project onto other people the exact same sort of fears and evils that might be stirring up somewhere inside of us. Even just day-to-day little stuff. I catch myself doing similar acts all the time, where I think the things I find myself most annoyed at often are the things that I know either I have done or that I'm capable of doing. There's all these traits in certain people when it comes to, even whether it's just temperamental, like whether it's personality traits that, when I was growing up, my mom was the outgoing one of my parents, and I definitely attributed that, or I got that trait from her. And growing up, it was always annoying. She was always, poking me and trying to talk to me all the time. It bothered me. And the older I got, the more I realized it was because that's how I am. We have these traits and these experiences that we go through, and I think we work in weird layers. There's who I am now,
yes, exactly.
And then there's who I was 5 years ago and 10 years ago. And part of me, as the person I am now, part of me hates the person I was 5 and 10 years ago. So then if I allow that hate to continue on and to fester inside of me, then any time I come across someone who is where I was at that period, I'm going to either lack complete patience for them or actually just all out despise them. It's like there's these really weird tensions that we have to constantly be dealing with in that sense, because there's certain friends of mine who, I'm in my late 20s, and I'm at that point in my life where I've gone through these ideological shifts from like your teen years and your young adult years, and there's certain friends I have now who they're starting families and they're figuring out who they are as a person, and in the process of that, they're still dealing with a lot of bitterness and hate toward either who they were growing up or just like their family growing up, or you know what I mean? And that hate, Absolutely. You can already tell it's like they're holding on to it. It's driving a lot of their motivations on a lot of the decisions they make when dealing with whether it's someone similar to them or someone who used to be similar to them in the past.
That's right. So the Stoics are often accused, or the misperception of Stoicism is that it is a philosophy that tries to suppress emotions, right? Going through life with a stiff upper lip, that sort of stuff. But that's actually not the case. What the Stoics were trying to do was to rather shift our emotional spectrum away from destructive emotions such as hatred, fear, anger, things like that, and toward cultivating positive emotions such as love, joy, a sense of justice, things like that. And the idea was that hatred, anger and things like that, they eat you up from the inside.
Yeah.
You become a worse person. You taint yourself if you let them grow inside yourself. You become bitter. You mistreat other people. You overreact. There's really no reason for that. It doesn't really add anything to your life. And in fact, arguably, it subtracts quite a bit from your life.
Yeah. So like when you look at just the scope of what's happening in the world today through that lens that you just mentioned there, where, with the Stoics, they wanted to focus more on, I guess, building than breaking down in a way. So what do you view the role of, how do you view the role of social criticism in the landscape today? Because it seems like with everything from, we have Trump, we have the Middle East, we have Russia, we have all these, there's so many ranging factors going on in the West and just all over the place. When it's scoped out in the media, everything is critical. Everything is very pessimistic, overblown, sensationalized, and it's very, very tribal. So, I mean, with that in mind, that whole idea that you just espoused there, like what role does, I guess, social criticism and almost, like just, I don't want to say negativity, but social criticism as it pairs with negativity in today's climate, how does it?
Well, first of all, you're absolutely right in drawing a distinction there between criticism and negativity, right? So criticism can actually be constructive.
Right.
Or at least can be neutral. It could say, look, I don't like this, and here's the reason why I don't like this, and I think it should be stopped. But it doesn't necessarily descend into sort of negativity or downright hatred. Well, let me give you an example. So a few weeks ago, 2 or 3 weeks ago, my Twitter sort of account got flooded by people that were shouting out things like, against Trump and, how can he do this? Was the moment that, the period that he had just come out, that he was separating children from of immigrant families from their parents, which is an awful practice. Absolutely. And it's indefensible. There's no question about it.
Yeah.
But all I saw was a lot of self-righteous posturing. A lot of people who just kept posting this stuff. Oh, this is incredible. This is absolutely unbelievable. This is blah, blah, blah. And at some point I got annoyed and I said, okay, let's try an experiment. So I came up with a list that I posted on Twitter, and I said, look, guys, I understand that people want to vent, and I understand people feel better by saying that, that's awful, et cetera, et cetera. But you're not doing actually anything positive here.
Right.
You're simply venting, which has there is a reason for doing that, but you don't need to do it in front of, in public, in front of other people. If you do it in public, most of the time it turns out to be a backhanded way of essentially do some kind of virtue signaling. It's like, you're presenting yourself as, look, hey, I have the right opinions here. I said, instead of doing that, the next time that you want to post something vitriolic about whatever is going on, why don't you do one of these things that I list here? And I put out a list of, like a dozen different things, which included items such as donating to the ACLU, donating to Planned Parenthood, donating money to pro-immigration organizations, volunteering for one of those organizations, going and organize a local resistance group against the Trump policies, go and organize a protest. All of those things are positive reactions. You're actually making a difference, however small it is. If you're on the other end, you're just shouting into the void, the other side I guarantee you, it's not listening.
Of course.
It's just, you're not changing anybody's mind. You just get really upset. The worst thing, in fact, is that, as I said, you kind of purchasing signal. But that's it. You're not doing anything else. So instead of doing that, just say very clearly, why you think that a certain policy is wrong. That's fine. There is definitely a place for criticism, as you were saying. But then turn around and try to do something about it. Try to organize something about it instead of just shouting into the void. Lots of people took me up. And, I bet that, that week, Planned Parenthood and the ACLU and the International Rescue Committee actually got a significant amount of donations.
Oh, that's awesome.
Because of that. Yeah, it's right. Exactly. So that's my attitude. I mean, look, I am not happy about the fact that Trump has been elected. My politics are pretty clear for anybody to see. If you just go to one of my blogs, you'll see exactly what I think about pretty much everything. So it's not a secret that I tend to be on the liberal left side of the political spectrum. But in and of itself, getting upset about it and getting angry about it doesn't do anything other than making myself feel bad about the situation. Because after all, anger, often people say, oh, anger motivates people. I don't know. I'm not so sure that that's the case. What motivates people, I think, is a sense of injustice. Right. And that's a positive. So for instance, somebody recently challenged me in a friendly way on my again on Twitter because I was talking about this idea that the Stoics think that anger is temporary madness that's really to be avoided. And so this guy said, well, look at the protests, the anti-Trump protests in England. Those were motivated by anger. And my response was, I don't think so. I don't think that most of those people were actually angry. They had a sense of injustice, and they felt that they had to show, by coming into the streets, that there was an injustice going on. But I said, I really don't think they were angry. And he answered, to his credit, he said, actually, you're right. I was in the streets, and most of these people were chanting and laughing and having a good time. I said, see? Right. It wasn't anger. Anger makes us do a lot of bad things, even when it's justified. I'm not saying, anger is a natural human response to injustice, absolutely. Yeah. But it tends to take over reason and to make us do things that we're going to regret.
Yeah, it is interesting to that point. I view it very similarly in the sense that, anger on its own just it fizzles out eventually without some kind of underlying motivation to it to keep it going, which force for justice is one of the biggest, best ones out there. I do think, however, that in contrast a little bit to what you said, it is interesting to consider how much media at this point in time focuses on outrage culture and how much of an effect that has on the day-to-day stimulus of people. Just because when you think, I fully believe, I'm with you in the sense that most of the people, you can't rally hundreds of thousands of people in a situation like that without real acts for justice. You can't do that if it's just based out of anger. So there's definitely the underlying theme there that you presented. But to some degree, I do think that a lot of what is enacting this in people right now, it comes from a sensationalized anger. And not in the sense that what Trump is, he's not as threatening as he appears. I mean it in the sense that news is using, such hyperbolic ways to describe events, and it's such a constant flow. Whereas for so many people, it's interesting because for so many people now, like in 2018, there are millions of people who are following the news every day and political and social issues every day that were never interested in it prior to Trump being elected. So
Right.
on one hand, that's great. I think that's really, it's good to have people more involved and aware, and they're playing their little part in the system. But on the other hand, I think it's interesting to think about how much of that is at its core motivated by this surface level hate. You know, like there might be some underlying
I think you're
themes.
right.
You know what I mean? So there's that kind of tension, because then once Trump is out of office and a lot of these big like polarizing issues start to simmer down, at least a little bit. You know, I think things are set in motion right now that might not be going away for a long time. But you know what I mean? Once it starts to simmer down a little bit, it'll be interesting to see, I think, the drop off of how many people actually pay attention to these issues, because most of these issues were there long before Trump. They're just now being highlighted in this new way that is getting a lot of people riled up. You know, like some in productive manners and some in just these vitriolic, you know, not very productive matters.
Yeah, you're right. But I think you're actually, in a sense, you're making my point. So yes, there is a lot of outrage out there. And what is it doing? It's making the climate even worse. I mean, think about it. How do we get to Trump to begin with? Trump has been obviously it's the result. It's a complicated issue.
Right.
Of
a lot of books being written.
Yeah, exactly. And there is a complex causality, including, quite frankly, a significant amount of fault on the parts of the Democrats who, for the last 20 or 30 years, have abandoned the middle class and the poor, especially the poor. There's a lots of stuff going on, and so a little bit of self-examination would actually be helpful. But certainly part of the rise of Trumpism is, in fact, this culture that has been stalked by talk radio show and by Fox News of what? Anger and hatred.
Right.
Fear, right? So that's what we get.
Yep.
Instead of when people go for those kind of emotions, instead of, you know what, there is an injustice here, let's talk about it. We need to solve a problem, right? That's what we get. So now we are in a situation which, as you were pointing out, media everywhere is just completely, encouraging this kind of, it makes good news. And you say, to some extent, it's a good idea, it's a good outcome that people are getting more involved in politics. But actually, I question that. Is it really a good outcome? Because it's a good outcome if these people actually do something about it, right?
Yeah,
but if all they do is getting upset and shouting the void, then no, I'm sorry. Actually, this is contributing to the problem. It's not actually making any better. These are the same people that will go eventually to the conclusion, will reach the conclusion, there is no difference between the two parties. They're all corrupted politicians, so I'm going to stay home and not vote.
Right. Yeah, a lot of that motivated outrage, it ends up resulting in nothing productive. But it is interesting because it does. You do, like, to your point, like you do see these street protests, and you see policy changes, and you see general attitudes shifting in some ways that you can point to and say, this is really, it seems at least that this is really beneficial to secular society as we move forward. We want more education and awareness to these issues, but then on the same token, other side, you see how much it's furthering the polarization gap between people, because the way the sort of game that media is playing right now, primarily left leaning on in reaction to Trump, they're sort of playing that Fox News talk radio game, because that's what has been drummed up for the past few decades since the rise of the religious right. That really, it is interesting how everybody wants to claim reactionary status. People on the left want to claim that they're just reacting to the right and vice versa. Everyone thinks, their side is only reacting to the other side, which is way worse. But it's interesting how, what do you do moving forward when it comes, when Trump is out of office and a lot of the dust settles, what will this have done to our social views? Because I think it isn't healthy on one hand for so many people to be so focused every day on politics when you have so many underlying motivations being ignored. I mean, take the entire, essence of what you've been talking about with Stoicism and your book and your work recently. It's ideologies like this that are the sort of undertones to society that shape, a lot of different people's motivations and their morals and all this. And a lot, I think, of what you would categorize under philosophy and religion or spirituality or just any kind of ethical frameworks, a lot of those are being brushed aside for now social justice in the political and economic sphere. And that's like all people are focusing on. Whereas to get there, you almost have to start at that ground level where you have to understand where someone's motivations are coming from, what their beliefs are.
Exactly.
You know, and that's being ignored.
Exactly. It's being ignored, and the left, well, not the entire left, but certainly a certain component of the left keeps ignoring the causality at play here. I mean, there are reasons why people vote for Trump.
Yeah.
And, and now they're bad reasons. I'm not arguing the point. There's definitely bad reasons, but they are reasons. These people are not, if you refer to them famously as the basket of deplorables, all you're doing is to handing the other side the victory.
Yep.
That's all you're doing. Yeah. It makes you feel better and superior, sure, when you say it, but then you lose the election. Then you're not doing anything positive. They're not actually changing things for the better. And besides, basket of deplorables, quite frankly, is an incredibly elitist way of putting it.
Oh, I know.
These are people. A lot of people in those kind of situations. A lot of people in the hinterlands, in the Midwest and the South of the United States, unfortunately, don't have a lot of education. They don't have a lot of financial means. They often have seen, their jobs disappearing over the last several decades. The Democrats have done close to nothing to help them, beginning with Bill Clinton. So it's like, wait a minute, hold on. Again, everybody's unwise. So why don't we start by looking at our own lack of wisdom? Because we have actually caused or helped causing the situation. But we don't want to do that, right? Self-examination is difficult. Self-criticism is difficult. It's much easier to just label an entire category, millions and millions of people as the deplorables, and then you give yourself a pass. You don't have to think about, how do we get here? What was my responsibility in these things?
Well, it's really interesting that you brought that point up, because that's something that I've always, the past few years, and I've really harped on that idea of, we have to sort of clean up our own house, whatever that might be, whether it's your own political party or religion, whatever it is, you have to focus on the internal issues before you can project outward onto like the issues around you, or else you just get either labeled a hypocrite or you don't truly understand those outside issues because you don't understand yourself. So I think it's interesting how in the past few years, even just the year leading up to the 2016 election, you had a lot of figures, like these public intellectual figures. Like, this is something I wanted to touch on with these. Like, there's a nice bridge where you had figures like Dave Rubin, who I'm not sure if you're familiar with him at all, but he's a YouTube talk show host, and he's one of these guys who he left the Young Turks news network, and he came onto the scene in 2015, I want to say, and his whole shtick was, I am a liberal, I'm from the left, but I'm fed up with, a lot of the issues that the left has been dealing with the past couple years. So I'm going to focus on cleaning up my own house and criticizing, my own party. So that was the sort of premise of his whole show. So he starts this show, and, the first few guests he has on, he's got like Sam Harris on, and he starts inviting some sort of center-right pundits, and he's going a little bit, there's a little bit of fairness in the beginning of the whole thing, but needless to say, over the course of the next, into the election and the next couple years, pretty much the entire show became a conservative, libertarian talk show. Yep. Whereas that idea, I think, that whole, he's classified in that group right now of public figures called the intellectual dark web, which I can never say with a straight face. But he's part of that group, and a lot of the
makes
people,
two of us, yeah.
Yeah, right. And a lot of the people in that group, they feel in some sense disenfranchised by their own tribal identity, which I relate to that. And a lot of the people in that group, I've come from similar backgrounds, and I can empathize with them. We have some views that I can share, meet at the table with them. But unfortunately, in my view at least, the past couple years, the rhetoric that's been espoused by the majority of the people in that group, whether it's a Sam Harris or a Jordan Peterson or this guy like a Dave Rubin, it's gone from, hey, we are people who align with, secular values, and we want to criticize our own tribe, which is this leftist, left-leaning identity. So it went from that to now basically disavowing that tribe entirely and almost not just creating a new tribe, which is this whole intellectual dark web, but moving much further toward the right in associations and the types of rhetoric that they espouse and attract, which I think is a huge issue in like pop culture intellectualism, which is happening right now. So like, do you have any thoughts on that long ramble?
Yeah, sure. No, it's an interesting issue. I mean, I'm very familiar with Sam Harris and somewhat familiar with Jordan Peterson, for instance. And I'm troubled by those kinds of trends that you just described, especially because these are intellectuals. These are people who, in my mind at least, ought to know better.
Right.
Now, of course, as we just said earlier, everybody has a story. I don't know Jordan Peterson personally. I don't know Sam Harris personally, so who knows how they got there. Mm-hmm. But I can definitely, so I'm not criticizing them as individuals. I'm not saying, these are bad people or anything like that. But I can definitely criticize their ideas. And as you were saying, it gets to the disturbing side, because one thing is to do some good self-analysis and self-criticism, and another thing is just jump ship altogether and go basically on the other side. It would be like, for instance, I've been involved for many years now with the skeptic community and the psychohumanism community, but because of my interest in pseudoscience, among other things.
Right.
And one of the things that I've done over the years was to, in fact, be somewhat critical of certain aspects of the skeptic community itself. Right. For one thing, a certain tendency towards scientism, towards sort of worshiping science instead of just putting it forth as the best approach to find out things about nature. So I think that people like Michael Shermer or Sam Harris and so on and so forth actually veer, or Neil deGrasse Tyson veer toward the scientific side of things. And I've been critical of that. And of course, also critical of a certain degree of sexism within the community. Mm. But to make the analogy, it would be like, so it's one thing for me to, from within the community, to say, look, guys, we really need to take a look at these things because there are some issues. We need to clean the house and at least have a discussion about this. That's one reaction. The other reaction, which is more like what you're describing from people like Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson, is to all of a sudden just jump ship and go in bed with Deepak Chopra.
Right.
It's like,
right.
No, I'm not going to do that. It's still pseudoscience. It's still bad stuff. It's still crap. So
right.
I'm not going to do that. And it seems to me that that's what people like Harris and Peterson and so on are doing. Just going so on the other side that they're losing track of what it is that they're doing and why they're doing it. Criticism and self-criticism especially is good. But suicide, it's not an option.
Yeah, like when I look at a simple association, like say Sam Harris and Ben Shapiro, it's like Ben Shapiro as a conservative pundit and Sam Harris as a left-leaning public intellectual, like if we can just use those base generalizing terms, I don't see anything wrong with the two of them being friends or associating or doing some debates or even like a video of them bantering together about what they have in common. Like I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but what's interesting is how they've somehow taken that and they've just focused on what they have in common and ignored the vast majority, like the rest of the areas where, like, whether it's religion or whether it's conservative versus liberal politics. These are big policy deciding issues and ideological deciding issues that are being ignored just to basically focus on deconstructing the left as a political party, which I think is not... It's only, like, to your point, it's only helpful to the extent of, hey, let's clean our own house. It's not helpful when someone like Sam Harris can go on a show like Ben Shapiro's and just be welcomed with open arms from all these right-leaning, conservative pundit figures, because then all that does is it discredits, Sam as a left-leaning person of interest, sure. But it just adds fuel to the division, and it gives the people on the right more ammunition to say, these are how the goalposts have been moving. And I think so much of it really does come down to just dishonest engagements and associations. And there's always talk of people getting taken out of context, and these aren't things that I right. believe. It's always like there's always these crazy defense mechanisms, whereas I think it's a total failure just to see on its face value. From the outside looking in, these are the the public associations you're making and the vast majority of rhetoric. It doesn't matter what books you wrote 10 years ago. It doesn't matter what blogs or what talks you gave 5 years ago. The vast majority of public spoken rhetoric that you are putting out today, this year, is veering in this one direction, and it's giving you one echo chamber. It's like this new tribe, this new tribal identity.
Yeah, I mean, Jonah Peterson is a perfect example of that, and especially his followers. I've written a couple of things about Peterson because he's also particularly well thought of within certain Stoic circles. So at some point I thought, okay, let me look into this, sort of take a serious analysis, do a serious analysis of these things. So I did. I wrote a 4,000 word essay on Jordan Peterson and why he actually does not reflect sort of Stoic philosophy, Stoic ideals. He never claimed to be a Stoic, but some of his followers do claim that there are similarities there. And of course, as soon as I posted that, the typical reactions and there were a lot of reactions from his supporters, are exactly the same kind of reactions that I got over the years every time that I criticized Sam Harris, which is, the first one is, oh, you didn't read him. And I said, well, how do you know that I didn't read him?
Right.
I think I did. Well, then you took it out of context. Well, okay, would you care to give me a context in which what I am saying about him is actually inappropriate? Do you want to elaborate on that? And as soon as you ask them to elaborate on the details, they disappear from the radar screen. Or you're being uncharitable or something like that. It's like, well, hold on a second. Answer the points. You're just labeling things, right? You're just telling me things like, oh, you're uncharitable, you didn't understand. Those are your own speculations about what's going on. I actually I did the work of putting out a 4,000 word essay on the guy. That's about 5 op-ed pieces in a newspaper. So by all means, I welcome the criticism, the counter-criticism, but then go there point by point and say, here's what is wrong and why it's wrong. The fact that you label my behavior as like, oh, you don't understand, well, that could be said of anybody,
right?
For any reason. And you have to back it up. Of course, I can't tell you the number of people who tell me that I commit basic logical fallacies without realizing apparently that I'm a professional philosopher.
Some keyboard warrior. It's just
not that I want to say the philosophers never make a mistake of reasoning. Absolutely, we all do. But come on,
right?
If you're accusing me of a very basic, very elementary thing, it's like it's very, very much very similar to the situation that used to be the case a number of years ago when I was writing about things like creationism, and somebody would say, "Oh, you don't understand the biology." I said, really? Because funny thing, because I have a career of 25 years in biology. I think I have some understanding of biology.
Yeah, you've done the work.
Yeah, again, it's not a question of invoking authority. It's a question of, I am a professional in that area. I spent time to come up with a detailed criticism of some notion. So it's as a courtesy and as a constructive way of interacting with another human being, you owe me the respect of assuming that I've done my work, read the work, and then respond. Don't just tell me, don't just dismiss the whole thing. It's like, well, you don't know what you're talking about. Well, I can say the same about you, and then what? Then where are we?
Yeah, you're asking way too much of people, Massimo. That's expecting a lot. Yeah,
it's often a problem. Yes,
it's really interesting with Sam, particularly as like a sort of cultish figure, because he had that whole movement of the new atheists that kind of built his career, and he got so many people, including myself. Sam, when I was 18, I read Letter to a Christian Nation, which honestly wasn't even really, like, of the books I had proceeded to read then, it wasn't like the strongest argument against religion, but it was strong enough to challenge the sort of dogma that I was raised in and of. So, I had like a really soft spot in like my soul where, as a public intellectual, like Sam's work, really helped to deconstruct those ideological parts of who I was. And I think that there's millions of mostly probably young men that were growing up at that time in like the sort of early to mid 2000s era that really, latched on to what he was writing and debating and speaking about publicly. And then somewhere along the way in the past few years, as the sort of movement dissipated into what it is now, which isn't really, there's not, like you had mentioned, like the whole, like how you've done work debunking in a way creationism, or at least heavily criticizing creationism as a ideology. Like, you don't really see a lot of public debates about with stuff like that, like you did 10 years ago. It's not really a topic. It almost feels like when you go to something like YouTube as a resource, you can find anything and everything, or like, there's all the blogs have been written. That was sort of like a moment in time where it's not happening as much right now. It'll probably come back in the next few years at some point, but it's not like a hot thing right now. But it's interesting how like figures like Sam, to where they are now, they have that fan base. Now they've picked up a lot of these newer fan bases from a more politically driven area. You had like you had people following him just for religious deconstructionist reasons, and then you had people following him for like motivations involving the Middle East, like Islamic motivations, or I should say, Islamic extremism motivations, because that'll always get taken out of context. But so he has these different sort of groups, to whereas now with the rhetoric he's putting out, it's much more neocon oriented when it comes to foreign policy and criticizing college campuses. And there's all this new movement now. It's like, it's really interesting to watch these fan bases collide, on the internet, because people want, like I said before, like someone like myself, if I'm criticizing Sam Harris, a lot of it's coming out of a place of admiration. Yeah. If I were you, you said you wrote that huge article. If I were to do something like that, it's a shame to think. I know Robert Wright had just written that article, that piece on Wired, about a couple months ago or so, on Sam Harris and that whole movement. And I thought it was a great piece. It was a really critical, and it was really he was really careful with a lot of the wording he put in there. But it's unfortunate that immediately, almost like clockwork, Sam tweeted out that everything was taken out of context, and he was being, and like, it's just that type of mindset is such a lack of looking internally at yourself and where your flaws could be in these scenarios.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, these, sometimes people do take things out of context, of course. I mean, so
it happens all the time.
It happens all the time. But at the same time, if this becomes your kind of a knee-jerk reaction, especially if it is aimed at people who have actually spent a lot of time in being very careful and, quote you extensively, come on. That's just not a serious way of reacting. Now you're basically talking to your fans, you're not actually engaging in an intellectual conversation.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so, I mean, just to kind of close out here, talking about all of that and talking about social criticism as a whole, on the political level, on the economic level, religious level, secular level, whatever, when you're looking at everything out there on social media right now and what's just generally portrayed in the media, how do you see us moving forward in a positive way? Like, what are some positive ways we can move forward that you see as options, or some things that you're seeing that are happening now that are giving you hope, or let's end on a good note. Like, what do you see as some tangible solutions to the political polarization and the divide and the lack of nuance in these conversations that a lot of people are having?
I hate to disappoint you, but I think that it's going to get worse before it gets better.
I agree.
Now look, it's not like humanity hasn't seen these kind of things before, right?
Right.
We go through cycles, and so polarization and irrationality go up, and then they go back down, and so on and so forth. So this thing hopefully will subside, before we get started a nuclear war or something like that. And things will get better, but there is no clear path, I think, at the moment. I mean, the problem here is that social media is a great tool, but like every tool, it's neutral in terms of its use. It's not inherently good or bad. It becomes good or bad depending on what we do with it. And unfortunately, at the moment, a lot of us are not using it well.
Right.
There are exceptions. I mean, there's a number of people out there, actual intellectuals that I respect, people that put out good content and are very careful about what they're saying. But of course, they tend to be followed far less than the people who shout angry stuff into the internet void.
It's not as popular.
No, exactly. If you one good way not to be popular is to be reasonable. It's like nobody likes that because there's no juice. It's like, okay, sure, right. I could agree, but but where's the excitement? How do I get angry if I try to be reasonable?
We want to be entertained.
Exactly. It's not entertaining, and it's not feeding the anger, the hatred, and so on and so forth. So frankly, at the moment, I don't see a hell of a lot of way forward. I'm sure it will happen. I mean, in that sense, I'm an optimist, but that's based on inference from the past.
Right.
We've seen on and off throughout human history situations that were not good, and then we somehow pull through. What frankly preoccupies me most at this point is not really necessarily the political debates of the day, but the fact that we keep not paying attention to the big ones out there, and the biggest one of them all is I think environmental destruction. That one is one that is slowly going over the cliff, and while we're bickering inside the car with each other on rather minutiae, we don't seem to be understanding that the car is very, very perilously close to the cliff. And if we don't do anything in the next few years, we're going to have suffer serious consequences. But then again, that also has happened in the past. I mean, human beings are, capable of reason and forethought and all that sort of stuff. And yet somehow catastrophes first have to happen, and then we fix them. We don't prevent catastrophes. I mean, look at the greatest era in the United States of social equality, right, was inaugurated by the 1929 crash of the stock market.
Right.
It had to crash. It had to put a lot of people out of work. It had to, starve a lot of people and all that. And then at that point, and only at that point, after the disaster, people say, oh, we got to do something about this thing. And that led to, several decades of, in fact, recovery and prosperity and things like that. Unfortunately, I think that's what's going to happen again. We're going to go through some kind of crash, and then we're going to look at each other and say, oh, boy, that was really stupid. Now what are we going to do? And, fortunately, human ingenuity being what it is, we might be able to pull through even from the next one. Well, I guess we'll see. It remains to be seen.
It's so paradoxical, unfortunately. I'm with you. And I feel the same way anytime that I even try. So oftentimes I'll be on Twitter and, reading the news of the day and seeing what the different, political affiliations are saying about the events. And I go to sort of write my 2 cents or, add in whatever constructive bit that I can. And in the middle of typing it out and trying to be as nuanced and reasonable as I can, oftentimes I look at it and I start to understand why so many people are partaking in like online mischief and trolling now. Because you look at it and you just get so discouraged. You look at just like what good can add in, this little bit into the void really do, when so much of what's popular is just this outrage culture and sensationalism and overgeneralizing. It's like you go to say, and it's like, you go to say something, you try to be too nuanced and you don't say anything at all. So you have to figure out where to stomp down and like where you really stand politically and socially, but also make sure you're attacking ideas and at the same time, propping up people's potential the best you can. Because, like a lot of the Stoic ideology you were getting into earlier in the conversation, if you have any hope to reaching across the aisle, or not even to agree, because I think people have that weird misconception where you think, oh, you're trying to play nice or moderate or centrist, so you just want everybody to agree. Like, no one's ever going to agree. There's always going to be binary systems in place, but you just want there to be some type of civil arrangement where even amongst mischief and trolling and all that, you can have that backdrop of understanding, of who the other is. Right.
Well, so we could perhaps close on this one. You mentioned Stoicism again, and there is a reason why Stoicism and Buddhism and similar philosophies are actually popular again now, as they were, like 2,000 or 2,500 years ago, or 2.5 million ago. And that is, they tend to be popular when there is general turmoil and when people feel like things are not under their control.
That's fascinating.
When you feel like, when you feel that this big upheaval is going on, there's all this stuff out there, and you really cannot contribute anything at a big level. So what people do is they then say, well, what can I do? And the answer is, well, start working on yourself first, and then start working on people on locally. So help other people, change change things little by little. The whole idea of both Stoic philosophy and the Buddhist approach is that you change the world from the bottom up, not from top down. Changing one person at a time. And so if you're making a difference for one person or 10 people or 100 people, that's a hell of a lot better than you think you might be able to do. Yeah, you cannot make decisions at the global level. This is not up to you. It's not under your control. But helping a few other people and getting through this situation and helping yourself getting through this situation, yeah, that one definitely can do. That's under your control.
Right. Love it, man. Awesome. So if we can just close on this then, like, what do you got going on now? Like, I know you had left Rationally Speaking a few years ago, and you're still writing everything. So, like, what are you working on anything now? Because, like, I know you got this book out, which I'll have in the show notes and everything, but what's going on?
Plenty of things. So I just moved my blog to Patreon. So to try to
awesome.
new exercise in sort of public intellectualism. So people can find me at Patreon under Massimo Pigliucci. The major projects are I'm finishing a book of Stoic practical exercises. It's almost done. And another one, which is a collection of essays by a number of authors, which is called Philosophies of Life, where we ask a number of people who actually live a particular philosophy, Buddhism, Taoism, Judaism, Christianity, and you name it, to write about them in terms of their own experiences, so that the reader can get a view of like 14 different kinds of ways of approaching life philosophically. So those are two of the major things. And other than that, I'm doing my teaching. I'm putting out the podcast almost every day.
Awesome.
It's called Stoic Meditations. It's a very short thing. It's like 2 minutes. And it's incredibly popular to my surprise. I mean, I started it recently, just a couple of months ago, and it's got more than 500,000 downloads.
That's amazing, man. People are yearning for, like you said. I mean, it's just like a hot time. It's a lot of chaos going on. People want order.
Yep.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Massimo, for the time. You've been super generous. This has been really, really insightful, and I really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Take care.
You too.